When Samantha Davis saves a stranger during a mugging, her life takes an unexpected turn. Losing her job and facing mounting uncertainty, she lands a promising opportunity at a prestigious firm. But as she navigates this new chapter, she soon realizes that her act of heroism has set off a chain of events she never saw coming. Samantha Davis had long since mastered the art of routine. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, she would hit the snooze button on her ancient alarm clock, letting herself indulge in 10 more minutes of warmth under the covers. But the world outside her window didn't allow for much indulgence. Her small, one-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city was as utilitarian as it came, barely decorated, just a place to rest her head and escape the chaos. Bills piled on the kitchen table, a constant reminder that life in this city was a fight she was barely winning. The job at Wilson & Burke, a local insurance firm, wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent. Samantha's daily routine was the only stable thing in her life, a necessary rhythm to keep her grounded. She spent her days at a cramped desk in the corner of a dimly lit office, processing claims and trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety in her gut. Her salary was just enough to scrape by, and she had long ago given up on luxuries like vacations or nights out. Every penny counted, and every day was a battle to stretch those pennies a little further. As evening fell, the walk home was usually her favorite part of the day, a time to decompress, to leave the gray walls of the office behind and breathe in the life of the city. The streets were alive with the hum of traffic, the chatter of people heading home, and the occasional distant wail of a siren. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an energy that made her uneasy. Samantha tried to shake it off as she walked down Elm Street, her usual route. The street was lined with small shops, now closed for the night, their neon signs flickering faintly in the darkening twilight. Her mind wandered to the bills she had to pay and the groceries she needed to pick up before the weekend. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost missed the commotion up ahead. The sound of hurried footsteps and muffled grunts caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw two figures struggling in a narrow alleyway between a pawn shop and a laundromat. One of them, a man, was on the ground, clutching his side. The other, dressed in a dark hoodie, loomed over him, something glinting in his hand. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. A mugging. Here, in broad daylight, or at least what was left of it. The man on the ground was in clear danger, struggling to fend off his attacker. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining the pavement beneath him. The sight made her stomach churn. For a moment, she froze, her mind racing. She could walk away. No one had seen her yet. She could turn around, keep walking, and pretend she hadn't seen anything. After all, who was she to intervene? She was just a woman trying to make it through the day, just like everyone else. What could she possibly do against a knife-wielding mugger? Her hands trembled as she considered the very real possibility of becoming a victim herself. But as she stood there, watching the man's desperate struggle, a surge of something unexpected welled up inside her, anger. Anger at the cruelty of the world, at the helplessness that had become all too familiar in her own life. And with that anger came resolve. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Samantha moved. She wasn't sure what her plan was, but she couldn't just stand by. She reached into her bag, feeling for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy, metal flashlight she always carried, a cheap but sturdy item she'd picked up at a convenience store months ago. She rushed toward the attacker, heart pounding in her chest. The man in the hoodie looked up just in time to see her coming, surprise flickering in his eyes. He wasn't expecting anyone to intervene, least of all a woman who looked like she'd just stepped off a long day at the office. "Hey!" Samantha shouted, her voice stronger than she felt. The mugger hesitated, and that was all she needed. She swung the flashlight with all her might, aiming for his arm. The flashlight connected with a sickening thud, and the knife clattered to the ground. The mugger cursed, clutching his arm as he stumbled back. "Get away from him," she yelled, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The mugger glared at her, weighing his options. Samantha kept her stance firm, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon, ready to strike again if necessary. Finally, the mugger made his decision. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Samantha's knees nearly gave way as the tension drained from her body. She dropped the flashlight, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The man on the ground groaned, bringing her back to the moment. She quickly knelt beside him, her heart racing for a different reason now. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice softer now. The man nodded weakly, his face pale but his eyes alert. "I think so," he managed to say, his voice strained. "Thanks for that." Samantha helped him sit up, assessing the wound on his side. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding enough to worry her. "We need to get you to a hospital," she said, glancing around for any sign of help. The street was eerily quiet now, the shops closed and the few passers-by too far away to notice them. "Not necessary," the man said, shaking his head. He winced in pain but managed a faint smile. "Just need to rest a bit." "Thank you, really." Samantha frowned, but she didn't argue. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way out of the alley. His steps were unsteady, and she couldn't help but wonder why he was so insistent on avoiding the hospital. But she kept her questions to herself, focusing instead on getting him somewhere safe. They walked in silence, the tension between them easing as they reached a busier street. The man seemed to regain some of his strength, and he finally spoke again. "You really didn't have to do that, you know. Most people wouldn't have." Samantha shrugged, her usual sarcasm creeping back into her tone. "Guess I'm not most people." He chuckled, a sound that was unexpectedly warm. "Clearly not." They reached a taxi stand, and Samantha hailed a cab, helping him into the back seat. She hesitated before closing the door, unsure if she should ask for his name or let him go as just another stranger in the city. But before she could decide, he reached out and lightly touched her arm. "Thank you, Samantha," he said, his voice sincere. The use of her name startled her, but before she could ask how he knew it, he closed the door and the cab drove off into the night. She stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the street, the adrenaline still thrumming in her veins. A part of her felt proud, even a little heroic. But as she turned to head home, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Samantha's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she leaned against the cold brick wall, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. The cab had long since vanished into the city's night, taking with it the stranger she had rescued. Her heart still raced, the adrenaline from the encounter ebbing away, leaving her feeling lightheaded and slightly disoriented. She wiped her clammy hands on her skirt, trying to shake off the lingering tremors. The metallic tang of blood still hung in the air, a reminder of how close things had come to going horribly wrong. She replayed the scene in her mind, the sudden rush toward the mugger, the heavy thud of her flashlight against his arm, the quick decision to stand her ground despite every instinct screaming at her to run. It was all a blur now, yet the clarity of that one moment, the choice to act, burned bright in her memory. She didn't know where the courage had come from, only that something deep within her had snapped at the sight of a man's life hanging in the balance. After the stranger left, she stayed in the alley for a few moments, trying to steady her breathing and gather her thoughts. The city continued its indifferent hum around her, oblivious to what had just transpired. With one last glance at the darkened alley, she finally pushed herself away from the wall and began the short walk back to her apartment. By the time she reached her building, the cool night air had done little to calm her nerves. She fumbled with her keys, her mind still racing, and finally let herself into the dimly lit hallway. The creak of the floorboards under her feet was a familiar sound, usually comforting, but tonight it only added to the unease gnawing at her. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, exhaling slowly as she tried to process everything. The quiet of her apartment was almost oppressive after the intensity of the evening. She wandered into the small kitchen, flicking on the light, and poured herself a glass of water. She drank it in one long gulp, then set the glass down on the counter with a shaky hand. A part of her still couldn't believe what had happened, how she had found herself in the middle of a dangerous situation, and how she had managed to walk away unscathed. Samantha knew she should feel proud, even a little heroic. After all, she had done what few others would have dared to do. She had stepped in, put herself at risk, and helped a stranger in need. But as she stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, all she felt was a strange emptiness. Was this what heroism felt like? This hollow, uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thoughts that buzzed in her mind like persistent flies. She couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs or second guesses. She had done the right thing, that much she was sure of. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had changed something, set into motion a series of events she couldn't yet comprehend. The next morning, the reality of what she had done hit her in a different way. She was more tired than usual, the events of the night before having kept her awake long past midnight. Still, she pushed herself out of bed, her limbs heavy with fatigue. There was no time to indulge in the luxury of rest. She had a job to do, bills to pay, and a life that required her attention. She arrived at the office later than usual, her eyes bleary from lack of sleep. As she stepped into the familiar gray-walled building, she hoped for nothing more than a quiet day, one where she could disappear into her work and forget the previous night's chaos. But the moment she walked in, the air felt thick with something she couldn't quite place. There were too many eyes on her, too many hushed whispers in the corners. Before she could make it to her desk, her boss, Mr. Collins, stormed out of his office, his expression thunderous. He was a tall man, with a perpetually sour look on his face, as if life had dealt him one disappointment too many. His eyes locked onto Samantha with an intensity that made her heart sink. "Samantha, my office. Now," he barked, his voice carrying across the room. Heads turned, but she barely noticed. The uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach last night returned, sharper and more insistent. She followed him into the office, her mind racing with questions. Had he somehow found out about what happened last night? But how? And why was he so angry? The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, and Mr. Collins turned to face her, his eyes narrowed. "Care to explain where you were yesterday evening?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. Samantha blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I went home after work, like I always do," she replied, though she knew the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mr. Collins wasn't buying it. "Don't play dumb with me, Samantha. I know you weren't home. Someone saw you downtown, getting into trouble, and now you're late to work." Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling for an explanation. I did go home. But something happened on the way," she stammered, realizing how weak the excuse sounded. "There was a mugging, and I—" "A mugging?" Mr. Collins interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You expect me to believe that you were out playing hero instead of coming straight to work?" Samantha bristled at his tone, the injustice of it all burning in her chest. "I didn't plan for it to happen. I was just walking home when I saw a man being attacked. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Mr. Collins's expression hardened, and he shook his head slowly. I don't care what you were doing. You had a responsibility to this company, and you failed to show up when you were supposed to. We can't afford to have employees who think they can run around the city playing vigilante and come to work whenever they please. Samantha felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the disbelief giving way to a rising tide of anger and fear. You're firing me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Collins's eyes were cold as he nodded. You're no longer needed here, Samantha. Pack up your things and leave. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stood there, frozen in place, as the reality of what was happening sank in. Everything she had worked so hard to maintain, her stability, her routine, her tenuous grasp on her life, was being ripped away in an instant, all because she had dared to do the right thing. With a numb sense of disbelief, she turned and left the office, the weight of her termination pressing down on her with every step. The satisfaction she had felt last night, the small sense of pride in having stood up for someone, had evaporated, leaving only a deep, aching void. Samantha walked out of the building, her head held high despite the tears that threatened to spill over. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But as she stepped out into the bustling street, the city moving on around her as if nothing had changed, she couldn't help but feel like the ground had just been pulled out from under her. Samantha stared blankly at the walls of her apartment, the silence around her as thick as the anger and confusion churning in her mind. Her belongings were still neatly packed in the boxes she had carried home from the office, each item a reminder of how quickly her life had unraveled. It had been 2 days since she was fired, 2 days of trying to wrap her head around what had happened. The shock had worn off, leaving behind a raw mix of disbelief and frustration that gnawed at her every waking moment. She had played the scene in Mr. Collins's office over and over again in her mind, searching for some clue, some explanation that might make sense of it all. But no matter how many times she replayed it, she kept coming back to the same inescapable conclusion: this wasn't just about her being late to work. There was something more, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her apartment, once a place of routine and refuge, now felt stifling, every corner a reminder of the life she was suddenly on the verge of losing. The rent was due in less than a week, and without a job, the math simply didn't add up. The familiar anxiety she had lived with for years had grown into a full-blown panic, clawing at her insides with every hour that passed without a solution. And then there was the stranger, the man she had risked everything to help. His face floated in her mind's eye, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite define. She had expected to feel proud of what she had done, but all she felt was betrayed. Why had he thanked her so sincerely if he was just going to disappear without a trace? She needed answers. Samantha pulled out her phone and scrolled through her call history, landing on the last number she had dialed, the hospital where she had assumed the stranger might have gone after they parted ways. She had called them the day after, hoping to check on him and perhaps get a name, but the hospital had no record of a man matching his description being treated there. Frustration prickled at her as she hit redial, the phone pressed to her ear. City General Hospital, how may I direct your call? The receptionist's voice was efficient, but not unkind. Yes, hello, Samantha began, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. I'm calling again about a man who might have been treated there a couple of nights ago. He was mugged downtown, and I'm trying to find out if he's okay. There was a brief pause. Ma'am, as I mentioned before, we don't have any records of a patient matching that description. Are you sure he was brought to this hospital? Samantha's grip on the phone tightened. I don't know for sure, but he was injured. He had a knife wound. Isn't there someone else you can check with? I'm sorry, ma'am, but if he was treated here, it would be in our system, and I've checked twice now. Is there anything else I can help you with? Samantha let out a long breath, her hope deflating. No, thank you, she muttered before ending the call. She dropped the phone onto the couch beside her, rubbing her temples in frustration. It didn't make sense. If he hadn't gone to the hospital, then where had he gone? And why hadn't he contacted her? He knew her name, after all. The more she thought about it, the more the whole situation began to feel like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. A thought crept into her mind, one that she had been trying to push away since the moment Mr. Collins had accused her of being reckless. What if the stranger had something to do with her firing? It seemed far-fetched, even paranoid, but nothing else made sense. Why else would her boss fire her so suddenly, without even giving her a chance to explain? And why had the stranger vanished as soon as she needed him most? The possibility gnawed at her, turning her frustration into a simmering suspicion that refused to be ignored. She paced her apartment, her thoughts running in circles. Could he have been involved in something shady? Was she just collateral damage in some larger scheme? She knew she couldn't just sit around and stew in her suspicions. She had to find out more about the man she had helped, even if it meant venturing into uncomfortable territory. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, determined to retrace her steps from that night. The city was busy as always, but Samantha barely noticed the throngs of people as she made her way back to the alley where everything had happened. The scene had been cleaned up, the bloodstains washed away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left behind, something that might give her the answers she so desperately needed. She stood at the mouth of the alley, her eyes scanning every detail. The broken streetlight, the crumbling brick walls, the graffiti scrawled across the back of the pawnshop. Nothing looked out of place, but it all felt wrong somehow, as if the alley itself held secrets that refused to be revealed. Samantha walked the length of the alley, searching for any clue, no matter how small. She found nothing, no sign that anything unusual had taken place there just a few nights ago. Her shoulders slumped in defeat as she reached the end of the alley, where it opened up into a quiet side street. She was about to turn back when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing across the street, watching her. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and his face was obscured by the shadows. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized he had been there the whole time, observing her every move. Samantha's heart raced as she tried to make out his features, but before she could get a better look, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. She hesitated for a moment, her instinct screaming at her to follow him, but the fear of what she might discover held her back. Instead, she hurried back the way she had come, her mind racing with questions. Who was that man, and why had he been watching her? Was he connected to the stranger she had saved? And most importantly, was she in more danger than she realized? As she reached her apartment, she was no closer to finding answers. The only thing she knew for sure was that nothing about this situation was as it seemed. Her frustration had given way to a deep, gnawing suspicion that left her more determined than ever to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The days that followed Samantha's unsettling discovery in the alley were a blur of anxious energy. She refused to let the gnawing doubts and fear paralyze her, even though they clung to her like a shadow. With her rent deadline looming and no source of income, she had no choice but to throw herself into the job hunt with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She spent hours every day hunched over her laptop at the small kitchen table, scanning job boards and sending out applications. The monotony of filling out forms, updating her resume, and writing cover letters was punctuated only by the occasional rejection email that pinged into her inbox. Each one felt like a small blow, chipping away at her already fragile confidence. But she pushed through, driven by the urgent need to keep her life from spiraling completely out of control. After a week of this, she had lost count of how many applications she had sent. The only certainty was that none of them had led to an interview, at least, not yet. But Samantha wasn't one to give up easily. She knew how to persevere. After all, it was how she had survived in the city for as long as she had. Then, just as she was beginning to feel the sting of despair creeping in, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and for a split second, she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in her gut told her to answer. "Hello," she said, trying to keep the weariness out of her voice. "Hello, is this Samantha Davis?" The voice on the other end was smooth and professional, but not unfriendly. "Yes, this is she," Samantha replied, her heart quickening. "This is Emily from Mayfair and Associates. We received your application for the executive assistant position, and we'd like to invite you for an interview." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Mayfair and Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in the city, known for its high-profile clients and competitive salaries. She had applied there on a whim, never expecting to hear back. Now, the possibility of working for such a renowned company seemed almost too good to be true. I would love that," she stammered, her mind already racing with the implications. "When would the interview be?" "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., Emily replied. "Can you make it?" "Yes, absolutely," Samantha said quickly, her excitement barely contained. "Great. We'll see you then. Please bring a copy of your resume and be prepared to discuss your previous experience." "Have a great day, Ms. Davis." "You too." "Thank you," Samantha managed to say before the call ended. She stared at her phone in disbelief, the words Mayfair and Associates still echoing in her mind. This could be it, her chance to start over, to leave behind the mess of the last few weeks and rebuild her life. But as the initial excitement wore off, nerves began to creep in. The stakes were high, and the pressure to make a good impression was overwhelming. Samantha spent the rest of the day preparing for the interview. She reviewed her resume, practiced answers to potential questions, and even tried on several outfits before settling on a professional yet stylish ensemble. The nervous energy that had driven her for days was now channeled into this one goal, nailing the interview. When the day of the interview arrived, Samantha woke up early, unable to shake the mixture of excitement and dread that had taken hold of her. The city was just waking up as she made her way to the Mayfair and Associates office, her footsteps quick and purposeful. The towering glass building loomed ahead, its sleek exterior reflecting the morning light. She felt small in its shadow, but she squared her shoulders and reminded herself that she belonged here, just as much as anyone else. The lobby of the building was all marble and chrome, a testament to the firm's success and power. Samantha checked in with the receptionist, her hands clammy as she accepted the visitor's badge and waited to be escorted upstairs. As she rode the elevator to the 20th floor, her mind raced through everything she had prepared. She knew her experience was solid, years of managing office operations, handling high-pressure situations, and supporting executives with demanding schedules. But she also knew that getting hired at a place like Mayfair and Associates would require more than just qualifications. They were looking for someone who could fit into their culture, someone who could handle the intensity and expectations that came with the job. The elevator doors opened to reveal a tastefully decorated reception area, where a young woman with a polished appearance greeted her warmly. "Ms. Davis, welcome to Mayfair and Associates. If you'll follow me, the interview room is just down the hall," she said, leading Samantha through a maze of sleek offices and conference rooms. Samantha's pulse quickened as they approached the room. The door was already ajar, and she caught a glimpse of a man seated at the head of the table, his back to the door. He was flipping through some papers, seemingly unaware of their arrival. "Your interviewer will be with you in just a moment," the woman said before disappearing down the hall, leaving Samantha standing in the doorway. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. As she did, the man looked up, and the papers in his hands dropped to the table. Samantha froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was him, the man from the alley, the one she had saved. His familiar face, now clean-shaven and sharply dressed, stared back at her with an expression of equal surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the shock of recognition hanging heavily between them. Then, he recovered quickly, his surprise melting into a charming smile that seemed at odds with the tension in the room. "Ms. Davis," he said, standing and extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to see you again, though I must admit, I hadn't expected to see you here." Samantha's mind raced as she shook his hand, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he contacted her after that night? And most importantly, why was he interviewing her for a job at one of the most prestigious firms in the city? "It's nice to see you too," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." Samantha sat down, her nerves now mingling with a deep sense of unease. There was something about the way he was looking at her, a hint of something unspoken in his eyes. She couldn't quite read it, but she knew one thing for sure: this interview was going to be anything but ordinary. Samantha's mind reeled as she sat across from the man she had saved, the man who was now her interviewer. The shock of seeing him here, in this polished office, in a suit that seemed tailored to perfection, was almost too much to process. Her thoughts swirled in a confused tangle, trying to make sense of the situation. What was happening? Why was he here, and more importantly, why was she here? He seemed to sense her unease, offering a smile that was meant to be reassuring, though it only made her more wary. "I imagine you have a lot of questions," he said, his voice smooth and measured. Samantha nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to gauge his intentions. "You could say that. This is unexpected." He leaned back in his chair, still holding that same disarming smile. "Let me start by introducing myself properly. My name is Nathan Cole, and I'm one of the senior partners here at Mayfair and Associates." Nathan Cole. The name clicked into place with the kind of finality that made Samantha's heart skip a beat. Mayfair and Associates wasn't just a prestigious firm, it was the kind of place that shaped the power dynamics of the city. The fact that Nathan was a senior partner here made him one of the most influential people in town. And she had saved his life, without even knowing who he was. "I didn't realize," she began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "That I was your interviewer," he offered with a slight chuckle. "Or that I worked here at all?" "I understand. I wasn't exactly forthcoming that night." "That's one way to put it," Samantha replied, her voice tinged with the suspicion she couldn't quite suppress. She wanted to be polite, to play the part of the grateful job seeker, but something about this whole situation felt off. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Nathan's smile faltered for a brief moment, replaced by a more serious expression. "Honestly? It didn't seem important at the time. I was just a man in trouble, and you stepped in when you didn't have to. That kind of bravery, well, it's rare." His compliment, though sincere, did little to ease the tension in Samantha's chest. She had spent the last few weeks questioning everything that had happened that night, and now, here he was, acting as if this were all perfectly normal. She couldn't help but wonder what his true motives were. "But now it's important?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Now that I'm sitting across from you in an interview?" Nathan sighed, his gaze dropping to the polished surface of the table between them. When he looked back up at her, there was something earnest in his eyes, something that made Samantha's heart beat just a little faster. "I didn't plan this, if that's what you're thinking. Your application came through like any other, and when I saw your name, I was curious." I wanted to know more about the person who was willing to risk their safety for a complete stranger. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. And the more I learned, the more I realized that you're exactly the kind of person we need here. Someone who doesn't just do the job, but goes above and beyond. That's why I wanted to offer you the position. Samantha blinked, the weight of his words settling over her like a thick blanket. He was offering her the job, just like that. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, this should have been the answer to her prayers. But instead of relief, all she felt was a deep unease that she couldn't shake. "You're offering me the job because I helped you," she said slowly, trying to untangle the mix of gratitude and suspicion swirling in her chest. Nathan nodded. "In part, yes. But also because I believe you're qualified. Your resume speaks for itself, and your references were glowing. You're more than capable of handling the challenges that come with this role." It was exactly what she wanted to hear, and yet the way he said it made her stomach churn. The logical part of her brain told her that she should be grateful, that she should accept this opportunity without hesitation. But there was another part of her, the part that had been honed by years of looking out for herself, that was screaming for her to be careful. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. "I appreciate the offer, I really do. But this all feels sudden. I mean, a few weeks ago, we were strangers in an alley, and now you're offering me a job at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. I don't know what to think." Nathan didn't seem surprised by her hesitation. If anything, he looked almost relieved that she wasn't just going to blindly accept. "I understand," he said gently. "And I'm not asking you to decide right this moment. Take some time, think it over. I want you to feel comfortable with this decision. Because if you do take this job, it's not just a job. It's a commitment, and I want to make sure you're ready for it." His words, though reasonable, only deepened the pit in her stomach. Samantha nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I'll definitely think about it." "Good," Nathan replied, his smile returning, though it was softer now. "And if you have any questions, about the job or anything else, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help in any way I can." Samantha forced a smile of her own, though her mind was far from at ease. "Thank you. I appreciate that." As she stood to leave, Nathan also rose, extending his hand once more. She shook it, the contact feeling strangely charged, as if there was more to this than just a simple handshake. "It was good to see you again, Samantha," he said, his voice warm. "You too," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. She left the office with her thoughts in turmoil, the weight of the decision she had to make pressing down on her. On the surface, this seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to work for a powerful firm, with all the security and status that came with it. But the circumstances surrounding it were too strange to ignore, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than she understood. As she stepped out into the bustling city, Samantha knew that whatever choice she made would shape her future in ways she couldn't yet predict. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead. Samantha's first few days at Mayfair and Associates were a whirlwind of new faces, unfamiliar protocols, and an atmosphere that hummed with the tension of high-stakes work. The offices, with their floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist design, were a far cry from the cramped, drab spaces she had known at Wilson and Burke. Here, everything felt polished, intentional, designed to impress and to intimidate in equal measure. But beneath the sleek surface, something felt off. It started as a prickle of unease, a sensation she couldn't quite put her finger on. The employees were professional, but there was a guardedness to them, as if everyone was holding something back. Conversations cut off abruptly when she entered a room, and the smiles that greeted her were a touch too tight, too practiced. It was as if everyone was constantly watching their backs, careful to reveal only what was absolutely necessary. Samantha tried to brush it off at first. After all, she was the new hire, and it wasn't unusual for there to be an adjustment period. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. It was in the hushed tones of phone calls behind closed doors, the hurried footsteps in the hallways, and the way her colleagues exchanged glances that carried an unspoken weight. She threw herself into her work, determined to prove that she belonged here. The tasks were demanding, requiring every ounce of focus and energy she could muster. But even as she navigated the complexities of her new role, she couldn't shake the sense that there was something more going on, something just out of sight. The first real clue came on a Tuesday afternoon. Samantha was working late, as she often did now, trying to stay ahead of the mountain of tasks that seemed to grow by the hour. Most of the office had emptied out for the day, leaving the space eerily quiet. She was about to shut down her computer when she noticed an email in her inbox marked as confidential. It wasn't addressed to her, she realized that almost immediately. The email had been sent by mistake, likely intended for someone else in the company. The subject line was vague, but it carried a sense of urgency: update on Project Saturn. Samantha hesitated, her cursor hovering over the email. She knew she should delete it, opening it would be a breach of protocol, not to mention unethical. But her curiosity got the better of her, fueled by the growing suspicion that there was more to this company than met the eye. With a quick glance around the empty office, she clicked on the email. The message was brief, but what it contained made her blood run cold. It spoke of test phases, containment measures, and discrete testing facilities. There were references to reports from various departments: security, legal, and even medical, each providing updates on something called Project Saturn. The language was clinical, detached, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that hinted at the true nature of this project. As she read, Samantha's heart began to race. This wasn't just some routine company initiative. Whatever Project Saturn was, it was being handled with extreme secrecy, and the lengths they were going to keep it under wraps were disturbing. The email mentioned subjects and variables, words that conjured images of experiments, tests, and possibly something far more sinister. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what little information she had. What was this project? And why was it being kept so secret? She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, but she couldn't stop now. She needed to know more. Over the next few days, Samantha began to dig deeper, paying closer attention to the conversations around her, the documents that crossed her desk, and the subtle shifts in behavior among her colleagues. She kept her suspicions to herself, careful not to arouse any attention. But the more she uncovered, the more her unease grew. There were whispers about a special task force within the company, a group that operated outside the normal channels, reporting directly to the top. They were the ones overseeing Project Saturn, and they were known for their secrecy and ruthlessness. Everyone knew better than to ask too many questions. But it was the unexpected connection to Nathan Cole that shook her the most. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that Nathan was just another partner, albeit a powerful one. But as she dug deeper, she began to see his fingerprints all over Project Saturn. He was involved, deeply involved. She found his name in reports, mentioned in passing as part of meetings and decisions related to the project. His involvement wasn't just tangential, it was central. He was one of the key figures behind whatever was happening, and that realization sent a chill down her spine. Samantha's thoughts spiraled as she tried to reconcile the Nathan Cole she had met in that alley, the man who had seemed genuinely grateful for her help, with the man who was now at the center of something potentially dangerous. The more she learned, the more questions she had, and the fewer answers she found. One evening, as she was leaving the office, she noticed a group of employees huddled together in a corner, speaking in low voices. They didn't see her, and she managed to catch fragments of their conversation, references to compromised data, increased security, and something about a deadline being moved up. The urgency in their voices was palpable, laced with an undercurrent of fear. That night, Samantha couldn't sleep. Her mind was too full of everything she had uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit together. She kept thinking about Nathan, about the role he was playing in all of this. Was he aware of the full scope of what was happening? Was he complicit, or was he as much a pawn as anyone else? The next day, she decided to confront him. She needed answers, and she knew that Nathan was the only one who could provide them. She waited until the end of the day, when most of the office had cleared out, before making her way to his office. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Samantha," he said, his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" She closed the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know about Project Saturn," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I've seen the emails, the reports. I know you're involved." For a moment, Nathan didn't say anything. He just watched her, his gaze penetrating, as if he were trying to decide how much to reveal. Then, slowly, he stood up and walked around his desk to stand in front of her. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm involved. But it's not what you think." Samantha felt a surge of frustration. "Then what is it?" "Because from what I've seen, it looks like something that's being hidden for a reason. Something that could be dangerous." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Samantha. There are things happening here that go beyond what most people can understand. But I promise you, it's not as black and white as it seems." His words did little to ease her concerns. If anything, they only made her more determined to find out the truth. "I need to know what's going on, Nathan. I can't be a part of something like this if I don't understand it." Nathan hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "I'll tell you everything," he said finally. "But not here. Meet me tonight at the cafe on 5th. We can talk there." Samantha nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding through her. She had finally gotten him to agree to talk, but she knew that whatever he had to say could change everything. As she left his office, the weight of the situation settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had come to Mayfair and Associates looking for a fresh start, but what she had found was something far more complex, and far more dangerous. And now, she was in deeper than she had ever intended to be, with no clear way out. Samantha sat in the corner of the dimly lit cafe on 5th, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The hum of the city outside barely registered as she waited for Nathan, her thoughts tangled in a web of doubt, fear, and resolve. She knew that whatever he revealed tonight would change everything. But even as she prepared herself for the truth, a part of her dreaded what she might uncover. The door swung open, and Nathan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they locked on hers. He moved toward her with a determined stride, his usual composed demeanor replaced with something more urgent, almost wary. He slid into the seat across from her, his expression tense. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice low as if wary of being overheard. Samantha nodded, her pulse quickening. "You said you'd tell me everything." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair, and leaned forward. "Samantha, what I'm about to tell you could put both of us in danger. But I owe you the truth, especially after everything you've been through." She straightened in her seat, bracing herself. "I'm listening." Nathan's gaze was steady, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that made her stomach twist. Project Saturn isn't just some corporate initiative. It's a cover for something far more dangerous, something the company's leadership has been keeping under wraps for years. It's about control, power, and manipulation on a scale you wouldn't believe. Samantha's breath hitched. Manipulation? Of what? People, resources, even information, Nathan replied, his tone grim. The project is focused on using advanced technology and data analytics to influence decision-making at the highest levels, government, corporations, even public opinion. They've been testing it in secret, refining their methods, and they've already started implementing it in ways that affect millions of people without them even knowing. Her heart pounded in her chest, the implications of his words sinking in like a cold weight. And the people who disappear? The ones who get too close to the truth? Nathan's jaw tightened. They're dealt with. Sometimes they're bought off, other times, they're removed. Permanently. Samantha stared at him, horror creeping through her veins. And you're involved in this? Nathan shook his head, a shadow of regret passing over his features. I didn't know the full extent when I joined the project. I thought it was about innovation, about pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But as I got deeper into it, I realized what was really happening. By then, it was too late. I was already implicated. She leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything. So why are you telling me this now? Why not before? Nathan's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in him. Because you deserve to know. You risked your life for me, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make things right. Samantha's mind raced, torn between disbelief and the cold, hard reality of what she was hearing. So what do I do now? Expose them? Go to the authorities? Nathan's expression darkened. If you do that, they'll come after you. They'll destroy your life, just like they've done to others who tried to take them down. They have connections everywhere, and they won't hesitate to use them. A heavy silence fell between them as Samantha grappled with the gravity of her situation. She had uncovered a conspiracy that went far beyond anything she had imagined, one that could have devastating consequences if exposed. But to keep it secret meant living with the knowledge that she was complicit in something fundamentally wrong, something that could hurt countless innocent people. You're asking me to choose between my life and my conscience, she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. Nathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding her in the midst of her turmoil. I'm not asking you to do anything, Samantha. But I will help you, whatever you decide. I don't want to see you hurt. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of deception, but all she saw was sincerity, mixed with a deep sadness. What will happen to you if I expose them? Nathan hesitated, then gave a small, resigned smile. I'll probably disappear, too. But if that's what it takes to bring them down, then so be it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the enormity of what he was saying. Nathan had gotten in over his head, and now he was willing to sacrifice himself to right the wrongs he had become part of. But she knew that exposing the truth would mean giving up everything she had worked so hard to achieve, including the safety and stability she had finally found. The cafe around them seemed to fade away as Samantha weighed her options, her heart torn between fear and a desperate need for justice. She could walk away from this, protect herself, and pretend she had never uncovered the truth. Or she could take the risk, knowing it might cost her everything. I can't do this alone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathan squeezed her hand gently. You won't have to. I'm with you, no matter what. For a long moment, she stared at him, her mind swirling with doubt and determination. Then, with a deep breath, she made her decision. "I'm going to expose them," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "But we have to be smart about it. We need to gather evidence, something irrefutable, and we need to make sure it gets out in a way they can't control." Nathan nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his eyes. "I know where we can start. There's a secure server in the company's basement that holds all the files on Project Saturn. If we can access it, we'll have everything we need." Samantha felt a surge of adrenaline as the plan began to take shape. "Then let's do it. We'll bring them down together." As they left the cafe, the weight of the decision still heavy on her shoulders, Samantha knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, fraught with risks she couldn't fully anticipate. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that cut through the fear. They arrived at Mayfair and Associates later that night, slipping through the shadows of the empty office. Nathan led her to the basement, where the secure server was housed behind layers of security. With a mix of skill and luck, they bypassed the defenses, their hearts pounding in unison. When they finally accessed the files, the truth was even more damning than Samantha had imagined. There were records of illegal surveillance, data manipulation, and blackmail, all tied to Project Saturn. The files detailed how the project had been used to sway elections, ruin careers, and control entire industries. But as they copied the files onto a secure drive, a chilling realization struck Samantha. There was one last file, labeled with a name she recognized, her own. She opened it, her heart in her throat, and saw a report detailing her firing from Wilson and Burke, orchestrated by Mayfair and Associates to push her into their fold. Her heroic act of saving Nathan had been part of a calculated plan to recruit her, knowing she was desperate and vulnerable. Her hands trembled as she turned to Nathan, betrayal burning in her chest. "You knew," she whispered, the words like acid on her tongue. Nathan's face paled, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening, filled with all the unspoken truths that now lay bare between them. Samantha felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. She had been a pawn in their game, but she wouldn't let them win. With a final, determined breath, she took the drive and walked out of the building, leaving Nathan standing in the shadows of his own making. The next morning, the files were leaked to the press, sparking a firestorm of scandal that engulfed Mayfair and Associates. The company's leadership was exposed, arrests were made, and Project Saturn was dismantled piece by piece. But Samantha's victory came at a cost. She had lost her job, her sense of security, and whatever trust she had left in Nathan. But she had gained something far more valuable, her integrity, and the knowledge that she had done the right thing, no matter the cost. As she walked away from the chaos, leaving the ruins of Mayfair and Associates behind her, Samantha knew that she would rebuild her life on her own terms. And this time, she wouldn't be anyone's pawn.